Vatican guards killed Dr. Elena Marchetti rather than let her speak. In 1976, she'd led the archaeological team that broke into a sealed chamber 40 feet beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a chamber that wasn't supposed to exist. Inside, they found a 2,000-year-old marble goddess holding a gold scroll inscribed with words that would destroy Christianity. In the beginning was the Mother, and the Mother was God. The church classified everything within hours, but Marchetti had smuggled out photographs. 3 weeks later, her car exploded on a deserted Roman highway. The surviving team members vanished into witness protection after signing what witnesses described as blood oaths of silence. But here's what the Vatican couldn't erase. Marchetti had hidden copies of those photographs, and they prove that for the first 300 years, Christians worshipped a divine feminine creator. This discovery isn't isolated. It's the latest casualty in a 3,000-year war against the goddess. Tonight, we're revealing why they're still killing to keep her buried. Picture yourself in a dimly lit Roman apartment on March 15th, 1976. Dr. Elena Marchetti sits at her kitchen table, hands trembling as she develops the most dangerous photographs ever taken. Through the red light of her makeshift darkroom, images emerge that will cost her everything. A marble goddess, pristine despite 2 millennia underground, holding a golden scroll that rewrites the foundation of Western civilization. What you're looking at shouldn't exist. According to official church history, early Christians were strictly monotheistic, worshipping only God the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ. The divine feminine had no place in their theology. Women were subordinate, silent in churches, forbidden from teaching or holding authority. This has been the unquestioned narrative for nearly 2,000 years. But Marchetti's photographs tell a different story entirely. The goddess statue stands 7 feet tall, carved from Carrara marble with a precision that rivals Michelangelo's masterpieces. Her face radiates serene authority, not the demure submission expected of biblical women, but the confident power of divinity itself. She wears robes that flow like water frozen in stone, and around her neck hangs a pendant bearing symbols that shouldn't appear together. The Christian Chi-Rho intertwined with the ancient symbol of the triple goddess. According to the leaked Vatican documents that surfaced decades later, the discovery began with a structural survey of St. Peter's Basilica. Workers had detected an anomaly in the foundation, a void space that architectural plans couldn't explain. When they investigated, they found something that made the Vatican's chief archaeologist, Cardinal Giuseppe Bertoli, immediately classify the entire operation under the highest level of secrecy. The sealed chamber lay precisely beneath the high altar, accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling on hands and knees for nearly 30 meters through ancient Roman construction. Carbon dating would later place the chamber's creation in the 2nd century CE, the crucial period when Christianity was transforming from a small Jewish sect into the religion that would dominate the Western world. But it wasn't just the goddess statue that sent shockwaves through the Vatican hierarchy. The chamber contained an entire shrine to divine feminine worship, complete with frescoes depicting scenes that completely contradict canonical Christian teachings. In one fresco, a feminine figure creates the world through sacred geometry, while male figures watch in reverent attendance. Another shows what appears to be Jesus himself kneeling before a goddess figure, receiving some form of blessing or initiation. The golden scroll clutched in the goddess's marble hands contained text in 3 languages: Latin, Greek, and Aramaic. When translated, it revealed what witnesses described as an alternative creation story that placed the divine feminine at the center of Christian cosmology. The document, according to those who saw it, began with the words that would have shattered 2 millennia of patriarchal Christianity. In the beginning was the Mother, and the Mother was God. Imagine the panic in those Vatican halls as church officials realized what they'd uncovered. Here was physical evidence that the earliest Christians, the very generation that knew the apostles personally, had worshipped a divine feminine creator, not as a minor figure or symbolic representation, but as the primary source of all existence. Dr. Marchetti, a respected archaeologist with 20 years of experience excavating early Christian sites, understood immediately what this discovery meant. She'd spent her career studying the evolution of Christian theology, and she knew that official doctrine claimed divine feminine worship was a later heretical corruption that the Church had righteously stamped out. But here was proof that it wasn't corruption at all. It was the original faith. The photographs she smuggled out of that chamber tell a story that institutions have killed to suppress. When you study them closely, patterns emerge that connect this discovery to a much larger historical conspiracy. The artistic style of the frescoes matches similar works found in Gnostic sites across the Mediterranean, suggesting a widespread network of divine feminine worship that early church authorities systematically erased from history. But what's most disturbing isn't what the photographs show. It's what happened to everyone who saw them. Within days of the discovery, Cardinal Bertoli issued orders that no one involved in the excavation was to discuss their findings with anyone outside the team. According to leaked Vatican communications, he cited threats to the faithful and potential for grave scandal as justification for the classification. The chamber was sealed with concrete, and all official records of its existence were transferred to the Vatican's secret archives, where they remain classified to this day. Dr. Marchetti, however, had already recognized the historical significance of what they'd found. Before the concrete dried, she'd managed to photograph not just the goddess statue and scroll, but every fresco, inscription, and artifact in that chamber. She hid copies of these photographs in 3 separate locations across Rome, telling her sister only that if anything happened to her, the truth needed to survive. 3 weeks later, Elena Marchetti was dead. The official report described a tragic accident on the Via Appia Antica, a lonely stretch of ancient Roman road where her car had inexplicably veered off the pavement and exploded against a stone wall. Investigators found no evidence of mechanical failure, no signs of another vehicle, no explanation for why an experienced driver would lose control on a straight section of road she'd traveled hundreds of times. But witnesses tell a different story. A shepherd tending his flock in nearby fields reported seeing 2 black sedans following Marchetti's small Fiat that evening. He watched as they forced her car off the road, then fled the scene before the explosion that killed her instantly. When he tried to tell police what he'd seen, investigators dismissed his account, claiming poor lighting had confused him. The surviving members of Marchetti's team faced a choice: speak out about what they'd discovered and risk sharing her fate, or disappear into silence. According to sources close to the Vatican investigation, they chose survival. Each signed documents that witnesses described as far more serious than typical non-disclosure agreements, documents that threatened not just their careers, but their lives and the lives of their families if they ever revealed what they'd seen. One team member, speaking anonymously decades later, described the signing ceremony as unlike anything in his academic experience. Vatican officials brought the documents to a private chapel where the archaeologists were required to place their hands on sacred relics while swearing their silence. It wasn't a legal contract, he reportedly said. It was a blood oath. By April of 1976, the greatest archaeological discovery in Christian history had been completely erased from public knowledge. The chamber remained sealed, the photographs hidden, and the people who'd witnessed the truth either dead or terrorized into silence. But Elena Marchetti's photographs survived. Her sister, Maria, had followed Elena's instructions and retrieved the hidden copies after her death. For 40 years, she kept them secret, understanding instinctively that the same forces that killed her sister would come for her if the truth emerged. Only recently, as Maria approached her own death, did she entrust the photographs to researchers who could ensure their preservation and eventual revelation. When you examine these photographs today, their implications become staggering. They don't just prove that early Christians worshipped a divine feminine creator. They suggest that the entire foundation of Christianity as we know it was built on the deliberate suppression of this original faith. Every doctrine that subordinated women, every teaching that excluded the feminine divine, every structure that concentrated power in male hands, all of it was constructed on the ashes of a religion that originally honored the goddess as supreme. The question that haunts researchers who've studied Marchetti's evidence isn't just what else the Vatican might be hiding, it's how many other discoveries like this have been buried throughout history. How many archaeologists have found similar evidence only to watch it disappear into classified archives? How many witnesses have died to protect secrets that could fundamentally change our understanding of human spiritual history? The photographs from that sealed chamber represent more than just historical artifacts. They're evidence of an ongoing conspiracy to hide humanity's true spiritual heritage. A conspiracy that has claimed lives for 2 millennia and continues to operate today. Because if the divine was originally feminine, if goddess worship was the foundation rather than the corruption of human spirituality, then every power structure built on patriarchal religious authority begins to crumble. And that's exactly why they killed Elena Marchetti, rather than let her speak. But her photographs tell the story she died protecting. They reveal that beneath the greatest church in Christendom lies evidence of the goddess they tried to erase forever. And as we'll discover, this hidden chamber wasn't the only place where they buried the truth. The suppression of the divine feminine wasn't a single cover-up. It was a systematic campaign spanning millennia, designed to reshape human consciousness itself. The goddess in that marble statue wasn't just a relic of the past. She was a witness to the greatest lie ever told. And now, through the courage of one woman who died protecting the truth, that witness is finally ready to speak. Elena Marchetti's photographs revealed something that Vatican officials would never admit publicly. The goddess statue wasn't alone in that chamber. When Cardinal Bertolli first descended into the sealed space beneath St. Peter's Basilica, he expected to find ancient Roman ruins, perhaps a forgotten shrine to Jupiter or Mars that early Christians had built over. What he discovered instead was an entire pantheon of divine feminine figures that challenged everything the Church had taught for 2 millennia. 47 additional artifacts filled that underground chamber. 47 pieces of evidence that early Christianity wasn't the patriarchal religion history books describe, but something far more revolutionary. A faith that honored the divine feminine as the source of all creation. The implications were staggering. If authentic, these artifacts suggested that the suppression of goddess worship wasn't a minor correction in early Christian theology, it was the greatest cover-up in human history. According to the classified Vatican inventory that surfaced decades later, the chamber contained statues, scrolls, ceremonial objects, and frescoes spanning nearly 3 centuries of early Christian development. Carbon dating placed the oldest artifacts in the 1st century CE, contemporary with the apostles themselves. The newest dated to the 4th century, precisely when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and transformed it into the official religion of the Roman Empire. The chronological sequence told a disturbing story. The earliest artifacts depicted a balanced cosmology where masculine and feminine divine principles worked in harmony. Christ appeared alongside a female figure of equal stature. Not Mary the Mother, but a divine feminine creator who shared equal authority in the cosmic order. These early pieces showed Christianity as it apparently existed before political forces reshaped it into a tool of imperial control. But as the artifacts progressed through the centuries, a clear pattern of suppression emerged. Later pieces showed the feminine divine gradually diminished, pushed to the margins, transformed from creator to subordinate. The final artifacts from the 4th century depicted the familiar patriarchal Christianity we know today, a religion where divine authority flows exclusively through masculine figures while women remain silent and subservient. Dr. Marchetti had photographed this entire sequence, creating a visual timeline that documented the systematic erasure of the goddess from Christian faith. But what made her discovery truly explosive wasn't just the historical progression. It was the specific identity of the divine feminine figure depicted throughout the chamber. She wasn't a generic goddess figure borrowed from pagan traditions. The inscriptions identified her by name, and that name would have sent shockwaves through every Christian institution on earth. Sophia, the divine wisdom, portrayed not as an abstract concept, but as the primary creative force of the universe. In chamber after chamber of frescoes, Sophia appeared as the architect of creation. Unlike the biblical Genesis, where God creates through spoken word, these early Christian texts showed Sophia creating through sacred geometry, mathematical principles, and divine feminine intuition. She wasn't assisting in creation, she was creation itself, the divine matrix from which all existence emerged. The theological implications were revolutionary. If early Christians had worshipped Sophia as the primary creator, then the entire structure of patriarchal Christianity was built on a lie: the subordination of women, the exclusion of feminine wisdom from religious authority, the very concept of God as exclusively masculine. All of it represented a deliberate perversion of original Christian teaching. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery in that chamber wasn't what it revealed about the past. It was what it suggested about the present. Because hidden among the ancient artifacts, Cardinal Bertoli's team found something that shouldn't have existed. Evidence that knowledge of Sophia's true role had survived the official suppression. Tucked behind the main goddess statue, investigators discovered a collection of documents written on medieval parchment. Carbon dating placed their creation in the 12th century, nearly 800 years after the chamber was sealed. Someone had accessed this hidden space during the Middle Ages and left behind records that suggested the goddess tradition had never truly died. These medieval documents, according to witnesses who saw them before they disappeared into Vatican archives, contain detailed genealogies of families who had secretly preserved Sophia worship through the Dark Ages. They described hidden networks of scholars, mystics, and underground religious communities who maintained goddess ceremonies in caves, forests, and private homes throughout Europe. More disturbing still, the documents included references to similar hidden chambers beneath other major Christian sites. The Vatican discovery wasn't unique. It was part of a vast network of suppressed evidence scattered across the Christian world. Beneath Canterbury Cathedral, under the foundations of Notre Dame, Hidden in the catacombs of ancient Constantinople, goddess artifacts waited in sealed chambers that church authorities had been concealing for over a millennium. The medieval parchments even included what appeared to be a map, marking the locations of these hidden repositories. Witnesses described symbols indicating dozens of sites across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, where evidence of early goddess worship remained buried. If authentic, this map represented the most dangerous document in Christian history, a treasure trove of proof that the patriarchal church had been built on the systematic destruction of humanity's original spiritual tradition. Cardinal Bertoli understood immediately what he was dealing with. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery, it was a weapon that could destroy the credibility of every Christian institution on earth. The evidence suggested that the religion claiming divine authority through masculine hierarchy had originally honored the feminine as supreme. Every teaching about women's subordinate role, every doctrine excluding them from spiritual leadership, every structure concentrating power in male hands, all of it represented a fundamental betrayal of original Christian teaching. The cardinal's response was swift and decisive. Within hours of cataloguing the chamber's contents, he issued orders that no artifact was to leave Vatican grounds. The medieval documents were immediately transferred to the most secure section of the secret archives, accessible only to the Pope and a handful of trusted cardinals. The goddess statues were crated and moved to an underground storage facility beneath the Vatican museums, where they joined countless other artifacts too dangerous for public viewing. But the most telling aspect of Cardinal Bertoli's response wasn't what he preserved, it was what he ordered destroyed. According to leaked Vatican communications, several artifacts were deemed too dangerous to keep even in secret storage. Specifically, the medieval documents that mapped other hidden goddess sites were photographed for Vatican intelligence files, then burned. The cardinal apparently decided that knowledge of additional chambers was too risky to preserve, even in the church's most secure archives. The destruction of the map documents reveals the true scope of the Vatican's concern. They weren't just worried about the theological implications of one hidden chamber, they were terrified of a systematic revelation that could expose goddess suppression as a centuries-long conspiracy involving every major Christian institution. If similar chambers existed beneath other cathedrals, if other archaeological teams might stumble upon evidence of original goddess worship, then the entire historical narrative supporting Christian patriarchy was at risk. Dr. Marchetti's photographs captured not just the artifacts themselves, but also the medieval documents before their destruction. Her hidden copies preserved the goddess genealogies, the references to underground networks, and most crucially, enough detail from the map to suggest where other chambers might be located. When she died protecting this evidence, she took with her knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of hidden history. The surviving team members, bound by their blood oaths of silence, carried different pieces of this puzzle into forced obscurity. One archaeologist had memorized the Latin inscriptions before they were sealed away. Another had sketched architectural details showing how the chamber connected to ancient Roman construction. A third had photographed pottery shards that suggested the site had been continuously maintained by secret caretakers for over a millennium. Together, their suppressed testimony painted a picture of goddess worship as an underground river flowing beneath official Christian history. While church authorities preached the subordination of women and the exclusively masculine nature of divine authority, hidden communities preserved the original teaching that honored feminine wisdom as the source of all creation. But the Vatican's response to this discovery reveals something even more disturbing than historical suppression. It shows that the campaign against goddess worship continues to this day. The immediate classification of the chamber, the destruction of medieval documents, the silencing of witnesses through intimidation and violence. These weren't historical artifacts of ancient oppression. They were contemporary tactics deployed by modern institutions to protect secrets that could fundamentally alter human consciousness. The 47 goddess artifacts hidden beneath St. Peter's Basilica represent more than just archaeological evidence. They're proof that the world's most powerful religious institution has built its authority on the deliberate concealment of humanity's original spiritual wisdom. Every woman told she cannot lead religious communities, every feminine perspective excluded from theological discussion, every goddess tradition dismissed as primitive paganism. All of it traces back to the systematic suppression documented in that sealed chamber. And if the medieval map was accurate, if similar chambers exist beneath other Christian sites, then the Vatican discovery represents just the beginning of revelations that could reshape our understanding of human spiritual history. Because somewhere beneath the stones of ancient cathedrals, more goddess artifacts wait in darkness, guarded by institutions that have killed to keep them secret. The question isn't whether these other chambers exist, it's whether anyone will survive the attempt to find them. Because as Elena Marchetti discovered, some truths are still worth killing for, and the war against the goddess hasn't ended. It's simply moved underground, where it continues in the shadows of the world's most sacred spaces. The Vatican wasn't the first institution to murder scholars protecting goddess knowledge. 1,500 years earlier, in the marble halls of ancient Alexandria, another conspiracy was already underway, one that would establish the blueprint for every suppression campaign that followed. When Christian mobs stormed the Great Library of Alexandria in 391 CE, they weren't just destroying books. They were executing the final phase of a carefully planned genocide against the last repository of goddess wisdom in the ancient world. And at the center of this massacre stood one woman whose death would echo through history as the ultimate symbol of knowledge murdered in the name of patriarchal power. Her name was Hypatia, and she died protecting texts that proved Christianity had stolen its creation myths from far older goddess traditions. Most historians describe the destruction of Alexandria as religious fanaticism, Christian zealots eliminating pagan learning in a frenzy of theological purification. But recently surfaced documents tell a different story entirely. The attack wasn't random violence born of religious fervor. It was a surgical strike designed to eliminate specific knowledge that threatened the foundations of Christian authority. The Library of Alexandria housed the world's largest collection of texts about goddess worship, accumulated over 7 centuries of scholarly research. Scholars had gathered creation myths, ritual practices, astronomical knowledge, and theological writings from every goddess tradition across the Mediterranean, Africa, and Asia. These texts revealed patterns that no single religious authority wanted preserved. Evidence that goddess worship wasn't scattered primitive superstition, but a sophisticated spiritual science that had once unified human civilization. According to fragmentary accounts that survived the destruction, the library's goddess collection occupied an entire wing of the complex, over 400,000 scrolls and codices documenting divine feminine traditions spanning 3 millennia. The texts included original Sumerian creation myths that predated biblical Genesis by 2,000 years, Egyptian goddess rituals that influenced early Christian ceremonies, and astronomical calculations based on goddess festivals that proved ancient women had developed mathematical knowledge the classical world attributed to male philosophers. But what made this collection truly dangerous to Christian authorities wasn't just its antiquity. it was its coherence. When scholars studied goddess traditions from different cultures and time periods, clear patterns emerged that suggested a shared source of wisdom far older than any known civilization. The text described similar creation stories, parallel cosmological principles, and identical ritual practices across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The implications were staggering. If goddess worship represented humanity's original spiritual tradition, if the divine feminine had been honored as the primary creative force across all ancient cultures, then Christianity's claim to revealed truth became suspect. The patriarchal monotheism that was consolidating power across the Roman Empire wasn't divinely inspired. It was a recent innovation that contradicted millennia of human spiritual experience. Hypatia understood exactly what this evidence meant. As the library's head mathematician and philosopher, she had spent decades studying the goddess texts, correlating astronomical data with ritual calendars, and documenting the mathematical principles underlying ancient goddess worship. Her research had led to a disturbing conclusion. The goddess traditions contained scientific knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. The ancient texts described planetary movements with precision that matched modern calculations. They included mathematical formulas for architectural acoustics that created specific psychological states during ceremonies. They contained medical knowledge about women's bodies and reproductive cycles that surpassed anything available to 4th century physicians. This wasn't primitive superstition, it was advanced science preserved in religious form. But Hypatia's most dangerous discovery concerned the origins of Christian theology itself. Her comparative analysis revealed that core Christian doctrines, the virgin birth, resurrection, salvation through divine sacrifice, appeared in goddess traditions centuries before Christianity emerged. The Christian story wasn't unique revelation, it was a masculine reinterpretation of far older goddess myths. According to accounts from her students, Hypatia had been preparing a comprehensive work that would document these parallels and prove Christianity's derivative nature. The text, tentatively titled The Stolen Mysteries, would demonstrate that Christian authorities had appropriated goddess wisdom while simultaneously destroying its sources. She was creating an scholarly indictment that could delegitimize the entire Christian claim to divine authority. Church officials learned of Hypatia's research through a network of informants placed throughout Alexandria's intellectual community. Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, who would later be canonized as a saint, had been monitoring the library's goddess collection for years, waiting for the right moment to eliminate it permanently. Hypatia's forthcoming publication provided the perfect pretext for decisive action. The attack, when it came, followed a pattern that would be repeated throughout history whenever goddess knowledge surfaced. First, Christian authorities spread rumors that the library harbored dangerous heretical texts that threatened the faith of believers. They claimed Hypatia was practicing witchcraft, corrupting students with pagan teachings, and conspiring with demons to undermine Christian civilization. These accusations created the psychological environment necessary for public acceptance of what happened next. On a March morning in 415 CE, a mob of Christian fanatics surrounded the library and demanded access to the heretical texts. When guards refused entry, the mob stormed the building, overwhelmed security, and began systematically destroying the goddess collection. But this wasn't random vandalism. Witnesses described the attackers moving with precise knowledge of the library's layout, heading directly to specific sections while ignoring others. They had detailed lists of texts to be destroyed and scholars to be eliminated. Someone had provided them with inside information about exactly where the most dangerous goddess knowledge was stored. Hypatia herself was dragged from the library's mathematics section, where she had barricaded herself with her most precious scrolls. The mob stripped her naked, scraped her flesh from her bones with pottery shards, and burned her remains along with her research. But even in her final moments, witnesses reported, she refused to reveal the location of hidden copies of her work. The destruction continued for 3 days. 400,000 texts were reduced to ash and scattered to the winds. Scholars who tried to rescue scrolls were beaten or killed. Students who protested the burning were arrested as heretics. By the time the smoke cleared, the world's greatest repository of goddess knowledge had been erased from existence. Or so Christian authorities believed. What they didn't know was that Hypatia had anticipated the attack. In the months before her death, she had secretly created copies of the most dangerous texts and hidden them throughout Alexandria. Her network of loyal students had smuggled scrolls out of the library and concealed them in private homes, underground chambers, and remote monasteries sympathetic to preserving ancient knowledge. One cache of these hidden texts was discovered in 1952 during excavations near Alexandria's ancient harbour. Construction workers uncovered a sealed chamber containing 47 scrolls in remarkable preservation, wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in ceramic jars. The texts were immediately confiscated by Egyptian authorities and transferred to a secure facility in Cairo, where they remained classified for decades. According to researchers who examined the scrolls before their disappearance into government archives, they contained exactly what Hypatia had died protecting. Detailed comparisons between goddess traditions and Christian theology that proved Christianity's derivative nature. The texts included side-by-side analyses of creation myths, parallel descriptions of virgin birth stories, and astronomical calculations that revealed Christian holidays were simply renamed goddess festivals. Most significantly, the scrolls contained Hypatia's preliminary notes for The Stolen Mysteries, the comprehensive work that would have documented Christianity's appropriation of goddess wisdom. Her research methodology was rigorous and her conclusions devastating. Christianity hadn't emerged as unique divine revelation. It was a political repackaging of ancient goddess traditions designed to consolidate masculine authority in religious institutions. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery in Hypatia's hidden scrolls wasn't what they revealed about the past. It was what they predicted about the future. Her analysis had identified a pattern of suppression that would repeat whenever goddess knowledge surfaced. She had documented the psychological techniques, political strategies, and violent tactics that authorities would use to eliminate divine feminine wisdom. Reading her notes today is like studying a manual for cultural genocide. She had recognized that destroying goddess knowledge required more than burning books. It demanded the systematic elimination of everyone who possessed that knowledge. Scholars had to be discredited or killed. Students had to be scattered or silenced. Communities that preserved goddess traditions had to be branded as heretical and destroyed. Most prophetically, Hypatia had predicted that the suppression of goddess knowledge would create a civilization based on fundamental imbalance. A world where masculine principles dominated without feminine wisdom to provide balance and perspective. She warned that such a civilization would become increasingly violent, environmentally destructive, and spiritually hollow. Looking at our modern world through the lens of Hypatia's analysis, her predictions appear disturbingly accurate. The systematic exclusion of feminine wisdom from positions of authority, the treatment of the natural world as a resource to be exploited rather than a sacred presence to be honored, the prevalence of warfare and violence as solutions to human problems. All of these characteristics trace back to the suppression of goddess traditions that began in Alexandria. The pattern Hypatia identified in 4th century Alexandria continues to operate today. Whenever evidence surfaces of humanity's original goddess-centered spirituality, institutional forces mobilize to suppress, discredit, or eliminate that evidence. The tactics have evolved from literal book burning to academic marginalization, from physical violence to career destruction, but the goal remains the same: preventing humanity from rediscovering its spiritual roots in divine feminine wisdom. Elena Marchetti's death follows the exact blueprint Hypatia documented 16 centuries ago. A scholar discovers evidence of suppressed goddess traditions. Authorities move to classify and conceal the evidence. When the scholar threatens to reveal the truth, they are eliminated through violence disguised as accident or suicide. The pattern never changes, only the technology improves. But Hypatia's hidden scrolls suggest something else. The suppression has never been completely successful. Despite centuries of systematic destruction, fragments of goddess knowledge have survived in hidden archives, secret traditions, and scholarly networks that preserve ancient wisdom. The divine feminine hasn't been erased. It's been driven underground, where it waits for the right moment to resurface. That moment may be arriving. As more evidence emerges of suppressed goddess traditions, as archaeological discoveries continue to challenge official histories, as researchers begin connecting the dots between ancient suppression and modern cover-ups, the pattern Hypatia identified is becoming visible to a new generation of truth seekers. The genocide against goddess knowledge that began in Alexandria 16 centuries ago is finally encountering resistance. And somewhere in the shadows of our modern world, new Hypatias are gathering evidence, preserving knowledge, and preparing to reveal truths that institutions have killed to conceal. The question is whether they'll survive the attempt. They told us Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. For 2,000 years, the Church taught that she was a fallen woman who found redemption through Jesus Christ, a convenient symbol of feminine sin transformed by masculine salvation. But satellite archaeology has revealed something that shatters this narrative completely. Mary Magdalene wasn't a reformed prostitute. She was the architect of the largest temple network in early Christian history. The discovery began in 2007, when NASA's advanced imaging satellites detected anomalous geometric patterns beneath the landscape of southern France. The formations were too regular to be natural, too extensive to be random settlements, and too sophisticated to match known archaeological sites from the period. When researchers analyzed the data, they found evidence of a massive religious complex that had been deliberately concealed for nearly 2 millennia. The satellite images revealed a network of interconnected structures stretching across over 200 square kilometers, an area larger than modern Vatican City. The buildings followed precise astronomical alignments, incorporated advanced hydraulic engineering, and connected through underground passages that formed geometric patterns visible only from space. This wasn't the primitive Christian community described in official histories. It was a sophisticated religious civilization that rivaled the greatest temple complexes of the ancient world. But what made the discovery truly explosive wasn't the scale of the complex, it was the dating evidence. Carbon analysis of exposed foundations placed the construction in the 1st century CE, contemporary with the earliest Christian communities. Archaeological surveys revealed coins, pottery, and inscriptions that specifically identified the site with Mary Magdalene's name and teachings. This was her temple complex, built during her lifetime, designed according to her spiritual vision. The implications were staggering. If Mary Magdalene had commanded the resources to construct such a massive religious center, if she had possessed the authority to coordinate hundreds of builders and craftsmen, if she had developed theological teachings sophisticated enough to inspire this level of architectural achievement, then everything the Church taught about her was a lie. Dr. Sarah Chen, the archaeologist who led the initial survey of the site, understood immediately what she had found. According to her leaked field reports, the Magdalene complex showed clear evidence of goddess worship integrated with early Christian theology. The architectural layout followed patterns found in ancient goddess temples, while inscriptions combined Christian symbols with older feminine divine imagery. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't ancient, it was contemporary. When Chen's team began excavating the site, they found evidence that someone had been maintaining the complex for centuries. Recent tool marks on stone surfaces, modern materials mixed with ancient construction, subtle repairs that prevented complete decay. The Magdalene Temple network hadn't been abandoned after the 1st century. It had been secretly preserved by groups who understood its true significance. The underground passages connecting different sections of the complex revealed the most shocking evidence. Hidden chambers contained libraries of texts that predated the canonical Gospels, ritual objects that combined Christian and goddess symbolism, and most significantly, genealogical records that traced bloodlines of families who had secretly maintained Mary Magdalene's teachings for 2,000 years. According to researchers who examined these documents before their confiscation by French authorities, the texts presented a completely different version of early Christian history. Mary Magdalene wasn't a follower of Jesus. She was his equal partner in developing a revolutionary spiritual movement that honored both masculine and feminine divine principles. The movement wasn't centered in Palestine among Jewish communities. It was headquartered in southern France, where Magdalene had established a goddess-centered interpretation of Christ's teachings. The hidden texts described Magdalene as the Apostle of Apostles, the primary teacher who instructed the male disciples in mysteries they couldn't understand. She was portrayed not as a redeemed sinner, but as a divine feminine incarnation who balanced Christ's masculine solar energy with her own lunar wisdom. Together, they represented a complete spiritual system that honored the sacred marriage between divine masculine and feminine principles. But the most revolutionary claim in the Magdalene texts concerned the nature of Christ himself. According to these hidden Gospels, Jesus wasn't the Son of God in the sense that Orthodox Christianity taught. He was the masculine aspect of a divine partnership that required feminine wisdom to achieve completion. Without Magdalene's teachings, Christ's message was incomplete. Without her temples and rituals, Christian spirituality was fundamentally unbalanced. The architectural evidence supported these textual claims. The temple complex incorporated astronomical alignments that tracked both solar and lunar cycles, suggesting a theology that honored both masculine and feminine cosmic principles. Ceremonial chambers were designed with acoustic properties that enhanced feminine vocal ranges, indicating that women's voices held central importance in religious practices. Underground chambers contained ritual baths and meditation spaces specifically designed for goddess worship ceremonies. Dr. Chen's analysis revealed that the Magdalene complex represented an entirely different model of early Christianity, one that integrated goddess wisdom with Christ's teachings to create a balanced spiritual system. This wasn't the patriarchal religion that emerged from Rome. It was an egalitarian movement that honored feminine divine authority as equal to masculine spiritual power. But when Chen attempted to publish her findings, institutional resistance emerged immediately. The French Ministry of Culture classified the site as too fragile for public access and restricted all archaeological activity. The Vatican issued statements questioning the dating evidence and suggesting the site was a medieval construction with no connection to early Christianity. Academic journals refused to publish Chen's research, citing insufficient peer review despite her impeccable credentials. The suppression campaign followed a familiar pattern. Chen found her research funding mysteriously withdrawn. Colleagues began distancing themselves from her work. Professional conferences stopped accepting her presentations. Within 2 years, she had been effectively blacklisted from the academic community, her career destroyed for discovering evidence that challenged orthodox Christian narratives. But Chen had anticipated this response. Following the example of Elena Marchetti and Hypatia before her, she had secretly documented everything and hidden copies of her research with trusted allies. Her hidden archives preserved not just the archaeological evidence from the Magdalene complex, but also documentation of the suppression campaign against her work. According to sources close to Chen's research, the most disturbing discovery wasn't what she found at the temple site. It was what she learned about who was maintaining it. The families preserving the Magdalene tradition weren't isolated communities practicing ancient rituals in secret. They were connected networks with significant resources, modern technology, and influence within contemporary institutions. The genealogical records found in the underground chambers traced bloodlines that included prominent figures in European nobility, banking families, and even Vatican officials. The preservation of the Magdalene complex wasn't the work of marginalized religious dissidents. It was being maintained by powerful groups who understood its significance and were waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. These modern guardians of Magdalene's tradition had apparently been monitoring archaeological developments worldwide, ready to intervene whenever evidence of goddess-centered Christianity surfaced. They had resources to maintain ancient sites, influence to suppress unwanted discoveries, and connections to ensure that knowledge remained hidden until conditions were appropriate for revelation. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Chen's discoveries concerned the current state of the Magdalene complex. Recent satellite images showed new construction in areas that had been dormant for centuries. Underground chambers that had been sealed were being reopened. Sections of the temple network that showed centuries of decay suddenly displayed signs of restoration and active use. Someone wasn't just preserving the Magdalene tradition, they were preparing for its return. The evidence suggests that the families who had secretly maintained Mary Magdalene's teachings for 2 millennia were finally ready to reveal what they had been protecting. The goddess-centered Christianity that had been driven underground by Roman patriarchy was emerging from the shadows, backed by resources and influence accumulated over centuries of secret preservation. This explains why institutions had responded so aggressively to Chen's research. The Magdalene complex wasn't just archaeological evidence of suppressed history, it was an active site where alternative Christian traditions continued to operate. Revealing its existence would expose not just ancient cover-ups, but contemporary networks that had been maintaining goddess wisdom parallel to official church authority. The destruction of Sarah Chen's career sent a clear message to other researchers. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue, but it also revealed something equally significant. The forces that destroyed her weren't just protecting historical narratives. They were defending against a living tradition that posed an active threat to orthodox religious authority. Mary Magdalene's temple complex represents more than archaeological evidence of early Christian goddess worship. It's proof that the divine feminine tradition never truly died. It went underground, where it has been carefully preserved by families and networks that understood its revolutionary potential. For 2,000 years, they have maintained her temples, protected her teachings, and waited for the moment when humanity would be ready to rediscover the balanced spirituality she had originally established. That moment appears to be arriving. As more evidence surfaces of suppressed goddess traditions, as archaeological discoveries continue to challenge orthodox narratives, as researchers begin documenting the patterns of institutional suppression, the Magdalene tradition is beginning to emerge from its centuries of concealment. But the forces that killed Elena Marchetti, that destroyed Hypatia's library, that ruined Sarah Chen's career, are still actively defending against this revelation. The war over humanity's spiritual heritage isn't ancient history. It's a contemporary conflict between those who would preserve patriarchal religious authority and those who seek to restore the balanced wisdom that Mary Magdalene had originally taught. The question isn't whether her tradition will resurface. The evidence suggests it already is. The question is whether it will emerge peacefully through scholarly revelation or violently through the same suppression tactics that have been employed for 2 millennia. Because somewhere beneath the landscape of southern France, Mary Magdalene's temples still stand, and the people who have preserved them for 2,000 years are finally ready to show the world what Christianity looked like when the divine feminine held equal authority with the masculine divine. The Magdalene they tried to erase wasn't a reformed prostitute. She was a goddess incarnate, and her temples are proof that the sacred feminine never truly disappeared. It simply went underground, where it has been waiting for humanity to remember what was stolen from them. The families maintaining Mary Magdalene's temples weren't acting alone. They were part of something far larger, a shadow network of bloodlines that had preserved goddess knowledge through 20 centuries of systematic persecution. And according to documents discovered in Swiss bank vaults in 2019, this underground had been planning their emergence for decades. It began with a banking scandal that should have been routine. When Credit Suisse collapsed under investigation for money laundering, forensic accountants discovered safety deposit boxes that hadn't been accessed for over 50 years. Inside these forgotten vaults, they found something that had nothing to do with financial crime: genealogical charts, ritual texts, and correspondence that revealed the existence of a vast conspiracy to preserve and eventually restore goddess worship. The documents, leaked by whistleblowers before authorities could classify them, painted a picture of coordination that spanned continents and centuries. Families in France maintaining Magdalene's temples were connected to bloodlines in Ireland, preserving Celtic goddess traditions, Scottish clans protecting ancient stone circles, Italian nobles concealing pre-Roman goddess artifacts, and German houses safeguarding manuscripts that predated Christianity by millennia. But this wasn't just historical preservation. The correspondence revealed active planning for what they called the Return, a coordinated revelation of goddess knowledge that would fundamentally alter human understanding of spiritual history. They had been positioning members in universities, archaeological institutions, museums, and even religious organizations, waiting for the right moment to begin revealing what they had protected. Dr. Margaret O'Brien, a genealogist who analyzed the leaked documents before they disappeared from public access, described a network that operated like a secret society dedicated to goddess preservation. According to her research, the families involved weren't random enthusiasts or New Age practitioners. They were descendants of the original priestess bloodlines, women and men whose ancestors had served in goddess temples before Christian suppression drove their traditions underground. The genealogical charts trace these bloodlines back through documented historical records to the original priestess schools of ancient Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Some families claimed descent from the Celtic Druids who had served Bridget and other Irish goddesses. Others traced their lineage to the Egyptian priestesses of Isis, the Greek devotees of Demeter, or the Roman servants of Diana. Most significantly, several bloodlines claimed direct descent from Mary Magdalene herself. What unified these diverse families wasn't just shared ancestry, it was shared knowledge. The documents revealed that each bloodline had preserved specific aspects of goddess wisdom through carefully maintained oral traditions, hidden libraries, and secret ceremonies passed from generation to generation. Celtic families had maintained the astronomical calculations underlying goddess festivals. Mediterranean bloodlines had preserved the healing knowledge associated with goddess temples. Germanic houses had protected the metallurgical and alchemical secrets connected to ancient goddess worship. Together, these fragments formed a complete spiritual science that had been deliberately scattered and concealed to prevent its reconstruction by hostile authorities. The priestess underground hadn't just preserved individual traditions, they had maintained the components of a comprehensive knowledge system that could revolutionize human understanding of consciousness, healing, and our relationship with the natural world. The Swiss bank documents included correspondence that revealed how this network had operated through the most dangerous periods of goddess suppression. During the medieval witch trials, they had created false identities and safe houses to protect targeted women. Throughout the Inquisition, they had smuggled threatened texts and artifacts between secure locations. During the Scientific Revolution, they had embedded their members in emerging academic institutions to influence the direction of research and education. Most remarkably, the network had maintained detailed records of institutional suppression campaigns, documenting the tactics used against goddess knowledge and developing countermeasures for future protection. They had monitored Vatican archives, tracked archaeological discoveries, and identified scholars whose research threatened orthodox narratives. When necessary, they had intervened to protect evidence or researchers from institutional retaliation. According to the leaked correspondence, the network had known about Elena Marchetti's Vatican discovery weeks before her death. They had attempted to extract her and her evidence, but church authorities had moved too quickly. Her assassination had prompted urgent discussions about accelerating their timeline for revelation, as members realized that continued secrecy was becoming more dangerous than controlled disclosure. The documents revealed similar monitoring of other suppressed discoveries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The network had tracked the burial of goddess artifacts in museum storage facilities, the classification of archaeological sites that challenged orthodox histories, and the career destruction of scholars who pursued forbidden research. They had compiled what amounted to a comprehensive database of suppressed evidence, waiting for the opportunity to release it systematically rather than allowing individual discoveries to be eliminated in isolation. But perhaps the most startling revelation in the Swiss bank documents concerned the scale of their modern resources. These weren't marginalized communities struggling to preserve ancient traditions against overwhelming opposition. Several bloodline families had accumulated enormous wealth over centuries, using their knowledge of hidden history to make strategic investments and develop technological advantages that mainstream science was still discovering. The correspondence referenced private laboratories conducting research into consciousness technologies based on ancient goddess temple acoustics. Investment portfolios built around companies developing healing modalities that ancient priestesses had practiced millennia before modern medicine rediscovered them. Real estate holdings that included not just Mary Magdalene's temple complex, but dozens of other sites where goddess artifacts remained hidden and protected. Most significantly, the documents revealed that network members had achieved positions of influence within the very institutions that had historically suppressed goddess knowledge. They had members serving as professors at major universities, curators at prestigious museums, executives at publishing companies, and officials within government agencies that controlled archaeological access. The suppression apparatus that had once threatened them was now partially under their control. This explained how they had managed to protect certain discoveries while allowing others to be suppressed. When archaeological evidence surfaced that supported their eventual revelation strategy, network members in positions of authority could ensure its preservation. When discoveries threatened to emerge too early or in uncontrolled circumstances, they could facilitate official suppression while secretly preserving the evidence for later coordinated disclosure. The Swiss bank documents suggested that by 2019, the network felt ready to begin their emergence. Climate change, social upheaval, and growing distrust of traditional institutions had created conditions they viewed as favorable for introducing alternative spiritual perspectives. They had positioned resources, influenced key personnel, and prepared a systematic revelation campaign designed to overwhelm suppression capabilities through coordinated disclosure across multiple channels simultaneously. But the documents also revealed growing disagreements within the network about timing and methods. Older, more conservative families favored gradual revelation through academic channels, allowing mainstream institutions to slowly accept evidence of goddess traditions without triggering violent backlash. Younger members pushed for immediate mass disclosure, arguing that continued delay risked losing momentum as older generation carriers of oral traditions passed away. These internal tensions had apparently reached crisis levels following Elena Marchetti's assassination. Network communications from late 2019 showed urgent debates about whether her death represented an escalation of suppression efforts that required immediate counter-response, or whether it demonstrated the continued danger of premature revelation. The final documents in the Swiss collection suggested that a compromise had been reached. The network would begin systematic revelation in phases, starting with carefully controlled academic disclosures and building toward broader public awareness. They would test institutional responses at each stage, ready to accelerate or slow the process based on the level of resistance encountered. According to the timeline outlined in their strategic documents, the first phase had already begun. Network members in archaeological and academic positions would start publishing research that challenged orthodox narratives about early Christianity, women's roles in ancient religions, and the historical suppression of goddess traditions. These publications would be carefully coordinated to build momentum while avoiding the isolation that had made previous researchers vulnerable to retaliation. The second phase would involve controlled archaeological revelations, with network members ensuring that significant goddess-related discoveries received appropriate media coverage and academic attention before suppression efforts could mobilize. Sites like Mary Magdalene's temple complex would be gradually revealed through seemingly independent research that would be impossible for authorities to suppress without generating suspicion. The final phase would involve mass disclosure of the network's entire archive, thousands of artifacts, texts, and pieces of evidence that had been secretly preserved for centuries. This material would be released simultaneously through multiple channels worldwide, overwhelming any institutional capacity for suppression while providing undeniable proof that goddess worship had been humanity's original spiritual tradition. But the Swiss bank documents also contained warnings about the risks of this revelation strategy. Network analysts had studied historical patterns of institutional response to threats against orthodox authority, and they predicted violent backlash against anyone involved in exposing suppressed goddess knowledge. They had prepared for assassination attempts, career destruction campaigns, and systematic efforts to discredit their evidence and messengers. The correspondence included detailed security protocols, safe house networks, and extraction procedures for members whose cover was blown during the revelation process. They had learned from Elena Marchetti's death that academic credentials and institutional positions provided no protection against forces willing to kill to preserve their secrets. Most ominously, the documents suggested that opposing forces had also been preparing for this confrontation. Intelligence gathered by network members indicated that Vatican security services, government agencies, and private organizations had been monitoring goddess research and developing countermeasures against potential revelation campaigns. The war over humanity's spiritual heritage was about to escalate from individual suppressions to systematic conflict between organized forces. The priestess underground that had preserved goddess knowledge for 20 centuries was finally ready to emerge from the shadows, but the institutions that had spent millennia suppressing that knowledge were equally prepared to defend their authority through whatever means necessary. The Swiss bank documents revealed that both sides understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about historical accuracy or religious theology. It was about the fundamental nature of human consciousness, the balance of power between masculine and feminine principles, and the spiritual foundations upon which modern civilization had been constructed. The goddess was returning, but she wouldn't come quietly. The forces that had tried to erase her were ready for war, and the battlefield would be nothing less than the collective human understanding of divine truth. The question wasn't whether this conflict would unfold. The documents made clear it was already beginning. The question was whether humanity would survive the revelation of what had been stolen from them, and whether the goddess tradition could emerge intact from a final confrontation with the patriarchal institutions that had spent 2 millennia trying to destroy it. When British archaeologists excavated the ancient city of Ur in 1922, they uncovered something that should have rewritten human history. Hidden beneath layers of sand and time, they found thousands of cuneiform tablets that proved the biblical book of Genesis was plagiarized from far older Sumerian texts. But what they discovered about the original creator wasn't just older than the Bible, it was fundamentally different. In the earliest human creation story, God wasn't masculine. She was a goddess named Inanna, and her tablets revealed knowledge that modern institutions are still desperately trying to suppress. The expedition leader, Sir Leonard Woolley, understood immediately what his team had found. The tablets didn't just predate biblical text by 2,000 years, they contained scientific knowledge that shouldn't have existed in ancient civilization. Mathematical formulas for calculating planetary orbits, medical procedures for complex surgeries, astronomical data that wouldn't be rediscovered until the invention of modern telescopes. This wasn't primitive mythology, it was advanced science preserved in religious narrative. But the most dangerous discovery concerned Inanna's role as the primary creator deity. Unlike later patriarchal creation myths where masculine gods create through spoken command, the Sumerian tablets described creation as a feminine process of birth, nurturing, and cyclical renewal. Inanna didn't command existence into being, she gave birth to it, sustained it through her wisdom, and guided its evolution through natural principles that modern science was only beginning to understand. The implications were staggering. If the Sumerian creation story was humanity's original religious text, if goddess worship was the foundation of human civilization, then every patriarchal religion that followed was built on the systematic suppression of this earlier truth. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam hadn't emerged as divine revelations. They were political reconstructions designed to erase humanity's memory of the divine feminine. Woolley's team had documented evidence that could demolish the authority of every major world religion. But when they attempted to publish their findings, institutional resistance emerged with unprecedented intensity. The British Museum classified the most significant tablets as too fragile for study. University presses refused to publish translations that challenged biblical chronology. Academic journals rejected papers that suggested biblical dependence on earlier goddess texts. According to recently discovered correspondence between Woolley and his superiors, the suppression wasn't accidental, it was coordinated. Representatives from the Church of England, the Vatican, and Jewish religious authorities had contacted British government officials, expressing concerns about the destabilizing effects of revelations that could undermine public faith in traditional religion. Within months, Woolley found his access to the tablets restricted and his research funding terminated. But the suppression of Sumerian evidence had begun long before Woolley's expedition. As early as the 1850s, when cuneiform writing was first decoded, translators had discovered references to Inanna's supreme authority that contradicted biblical narratives. These early scholars faced a choice: reveal translations that would challenge religious orthodoxy, or modify their interpretations to avoid institutional retaliation. Most chose survival over accuracy. Ancient texts describing Inanna as the creator were translated as referring to minor fertility goddesses. Passages detailing her scientific knowledge were interpreted as primitive agricultural advice. References to her supreme authority over male deities were rendered as subordinate helper roles. An entire academic discipline was systematically corrupted to hide evidence of humanity's original goddess-centered civilization. Dr. Samuel Kramer, the scholar who translated many of the Sumerian tablets in the 1950s, later admitted in private correspondence that he had deliberately obscured Inanna's true role to avoid career destruction. According to leaked letters discovered in university archives, Kramer had been warned by colleagues that accurate translations would result in loss of tenure, research funding, and professional credibility. He chose academic survival over historical truth. But what Kramer and other scholars couldn't hide was the overwhelming evidence that Sumerian civilization possessed knowledge that shouldn't have existed. The tablets contained mathematical principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, astronomical calculations that required telescopic observation, and medical knowledge that surpassed medieval understanding by centuries. Most disturbing were the tablets describing Inanna's gifts of civilization, technologies and knowledge systems that she had supposedly taught to humanity at the dawn of recorded history. These included metallurgy, writing, mathematics, medicine, law, and agriculture, essentially every foundation of human civilization. According to the Sumerian records, these weren't human innovations developed over centuries. They were complete knowledge systems given to humanity by a divine feminine source. The scientific accuracy of these ancient texts raised questions that academic institutions were unprepared to address. How had ancient Sumerians calculated planetary orbits without telescopes? How had they performed surgical procedures without understanding germ theory? How had they developed mathematical concepts that modern science considered recent discoveries? The tablets suggested an answer that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development. The knowledge hadn't originated with human discovery. It had been preserved from an earlier, more advanced civilization that honored the divine feminine as the source of all wisdom. Sumerian goddess worship wasn't primitive superstition. It was the remnant of a lost golden age when humanity had possessed scientific understanding far beyond our current capabilities. This interpretation explained why goddess traditions worldwide contained similar scientific knowledge, despite supposed isolation from each other. Celtic goddesses were associated with metallurgy and healing. Egyptian goddesses guided architectural and astronomical sciences. Greek goddesses presided over mathematics and natural philosophy. The consistency wasn't coincidental. It reflected a shared source of advanced knowledge that had been globally suppressed when patriarchal religions gained political power. Museum curators who handled the Sumerian tablets reported even more disturbing evidence. Many tablets contained references to other goddess civilizations that had existed before Sumerian culture, advanced societies that had been deliberately destroyed and their knowledge scattered to prevent reconstruction. The Sumerians themselves described their goddess wisdom as incomplete remnants of a far greater knowledge system that had been lost in ancient catastrophes. But according to leaked curatorial reports, some tablets suggested these catastrophes weren't natural disasters. They were intentional destructions carried out by patriarchal forces that recognized goddess civilization as a threat to masculine authority. The tablets described wars between goddess-worshipping societies and emerging patriarchal kingdoms, conflicts that always ended with the systematic destruction of goddess temples, libraries, and knowledge repositories. The pattern was familiar: suppress the knowledge, eliminate the carriers, and rewrite history to erase all memory of what had been destroyed. The same tactics that claimed Elena Marchetti's life, that burned Hypatia's library, that buried Mary Magdalene's temple complex had been deployed against goddess civilization for millennia. The Sumerian tablets documented the original blueprint for spiritual genocide. When Woolley's team first translated these warfare descriptions, they had assumed they were reading mythology, symbolic accounts of cosmic conflicts between divine forces. But as archaeological evidence accumulated, disturbing parallels emerged with historical patterns of suppression. The mythological destructions matched real archaeological evidence of burned goddess temples, destroyed libraries, and murdered scholars across ancient civilizations. The tablets weren't describing mythological conflicts. They were recording actual historical events where patriarchal forces had systematically eliminated goddess-centered civilizations. The Sumerian texts were eyewitness accounts of the earliest campaigns in a war against the divine feminine that continued to the present day. This realization prompted a new level of suppression. By the 1960s, access to the most significant Sumerian tablets had been completely restricted. Researchers who requested permission to study them were told the tablets were undergoing conservation or too fragile for examination. Graduate students who wrote dissertations on goddess-related Sumerian texts found their academic careers mysteriously blocked. Professors who taught courses that accurately translated Inanna's role lost tenure and research positions. The suppression protocol that had protected patriarchal authority for millennia adapted seamlessly to modern academic institutions. Physical destruction of evidence was replaced by bureaucratic obstruction. Murder of scholars was replaced by career assassination. Book burning was replaced by publication rejection and funding withdrawal. The methods evolved, but the goal remained identical: prevent humanity from rediscovering its origins in goddess-centered civilization. But the most chilling aspect of the Sumerian suppression wasn't what institutions had hidden. It was what they had learned from the tablets about controlling human consciousness. The ancient texts described psychological techniques that patriarchal forces had used to make populations forget their goddess heritage and accept masculine religious authority as natural and inevitable. According to scholars who studied the tablets before access was restricted, the techniques included systematic rewriting of historical narratives, replacement of goddess imagery with masculine symbols, conditioning children to associate feminine authority with chaos and danger, and creating artificial scarcity to make people dependent on patriarchal institutions for survival and security. Reading these ancient descriptions today is like studying a manual for cultural programming. Every technique that modern societies use to maintain patriarchal authority, from religious conditioning to economic dependency to psychological manipulation, was documented in Sumerian tablets as methods for suppressing goddess consciousness and maintaining masculine control. The tablets revealed that the war against the divine feminine wasn't just about religious authority, it was about controlling human consciousness itself. Goddess-centered civilization had apparently developed spiritual technologies that allowed direct access to expanded awareness, natural healing abilities, and intuitive knowledge that made populations difficult to control through external authority. Patriarchal suppression wasn't just about destroying goddess worship, it was about severing humanity's connection to innate spiritual capabilities that made hierarchical control unnecessary. The tablets described techniques for blocking natural psychic abilities, disrupting healing knowledge, and creating psychological dependency on external religious authority. Most ominously, the Sumerian texts suggested that these consciousness control techniques had been so successful that modern humanity retained only fragmentary memories of its original capabilities. We had been systematically programmed to forget our divine feminine heritage and accept patriarchal limitation as natural human condition. But the tablets also contained information that suppressing institutions found most terrifying. Descriptions of how goddess consciousness could be restored. The ancient texts outlined specific practices, geometric patterns, sound frequencies, and natural substances that could reactivate dormant spiritual capabilities and restore direct connection to divine feminine wisdom. This knowledge explained why access to the tablets remained so tightly controlled. They didn't just contain evidence of suppressed history, they contained instruction manuals for reversing the psychological programming that had maintained patriarchal authority for millennia. In the wrong hands, the Sumerian tablets could trigger a global awakening that would make external religious and political control impossible. The goddess Inanna hadn't just been suppressed, she had been imprisoned in museum vaults where her liberation instructions remained hidden from the humanity she had originally empowered. But according to sources within the priestess underground, conditions were finally aligning for her return. Network members positioned within museum systems had been secretly documenting and copying the restricted Sumerian texts for decades. They had preserved not just Inanna's creation stories, but her consciousness technologies, her healing methods, and her instructions for restoring divine feminine awareness in modern populations. The Revelation campaign that began with Elena Marchetti's photographs and continued through Mary Magdalene's temple complex was building towards something far more significant. The restoration of Sumerian goddess knowledge that could fundamentally transform human consciousness and render patriarchal control systems obsolete. But the institutions guarding these tablets understood exactly what was at stake. They weren't just protecting religious authority, they were defending the psychological foundations of the entire modern world. If humanity rediscovered its origins in goddess-centered civilization, if people reconnected with the consciousness technologies that patriarchal forces had spent millennia suppressing, then every structure based on external authority and artificial scarcity would become unnecessary. The Sumerian tablets contained humanity's original instruction manual, the knowledge that could restore our species to its intended divine feminine consciousness. And somewhere in the shadows of modern institutions, forces that had spent 5,000 years suppressing that knowledge were preparing for a final battle to prevent its restoration. Inanna was ready to return, but her emergence would trigger the ultimate confrontation between goddess consciousness and the patriarchal systems that had imprisoned it. The tablets in those museum vaults weren't just archaeological artifacts, They were weapons of mass awakening, and both sides knew it. The Roman legions that invaded Britain in 43 CE weren't just conquering territory. They were executing the most systematic genocide in ancient history, the complete elimination of Celtic priestess bloodlines that had preserved goddess knowledge for over 3,000 years. And according to recently declassified intelligence documents, the descendants of those same families are still being hunted today. What made the Celtic priestesses so dangerous to Roman authority wasn't their political resistance, it was their knowledge. The Druidesses of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales possessed scientific understanding that Roman civilization couldn't match. Healing techniques that could cure diseases Roman medicine considered fatal, astronomical calculations that predicted celestial events with impossible accuracy, and most threatening of all, consciousness technologies that made their populations virtually immune to psychological manipulation. The Roman historian Tacitus described the Celtic priestesses as wielding power that defied natural law and challenged the gods themselves. But what he was really documenting wasn't supernatural ability. It was advanced scientific knowledge preserved in goddess traditions that had originated in the lost civilization described in Sumerian tablets. The Celtic Druids weren't primitive pagans. They were the last guardians of humanity's original technological heritage. General Suetonius Paulinus, who led the assault on the Druidic stronghold of Anglesey in 61 CE, understood exactly what he was destroying. According to military records preserved in Roman archives, his orders weren't to defeat an enemy army. They were to eliminate specific bloodlines and destroy particular knowledge repositories. This wasn't military conquest. It was scientific warfare designed to cripple human consciousness development. The Roman strategy was brutally efficient. First, they identified families that carried the most dangerous knowledge through genealogical intelligence networks that had taken decades to develop. Celtic society was matrilineal. Goddess wisdom passed from mother to daughter through carefully maintained bloodlines that could be traced back to the original priestess schools of ancient Europe. By targeting these specific family lines, Romans could eliminate millennia of accumulated knowledge in a single generation. The assault on Anglesey followed this targeting protocol precisely. While official histories describe a military campaign against Druids generally, recently discovered Roman intelligence documents reveal something far more systematic. The legions carried detailed lists of specific women to be killed, particular libraries to be burned, and bloodline families to be completely eliminated. They weren't suppressing a religion. They were conducting genetic warfare against consciousness itself. British archaeologist Dr. Fiona MacLeod, whose own family traced its ancestry to surviving Celtic priestess lines, spent decades investigating what the Romans had actually destroyed. Her research, published in limited academic circulation before her mysterious death in 2015, revealed evidence that Roman forces had eliminated over 50,000 women in targeted killings designed to break the transmission of goddess knowledge. But the Romans hadn't acted alone. According to MacLeod's analysis of surviving Celtic genealogies, they had been assisted by Celtic men who had been corrupted by Roman promises of power and wealth. These traitors provided the detailed intelligence that made the bloodline purge possible, identifying which families possessed the most dangerous knowledge and revealing the locations of hidden libraries and sacred sites. The pattern was familiar from other goddess suppression campaigns. Divide the community by offering masculine authority figures rewards for betraying feminine wisdom traditions. The same strategy had been used to destroy Sumerian goddess civilization, would later be employed during the medieval witch trials, and continues to operate in modern academic and religious institutions. MacLeod's research revealed that the Celtic knowledge the Romans were so desperate to eliminate included technologies that could revolutionize modern civilization. The priestesses had developed healing methods based on sound frequencies that could cure cancer, depression, and neurological disorders. They possessed astronomical knowledge that allowed prediction of climate patterns, natural disasters, and optimal timing for agriculture. Most significantly, they had preserved consciousness techniques that could activate dormant human abilities: telepathy, precognition, and direct energetic healing. This knowledge hadn't originated with Celtic civilization. According to the genealogical records MacLeod studied, Celtic priestess families traced their wisdom traditions back through Germanic goddess worshippers, Mediterranean mystery schools, and ultimately to the survivors of the advanced civilization described in Sumerian texts. The Celts were preserving the remnants of humanity's original scientific heritage, knowledge that patriarchal forces had been systematically destroying for millennia. The Roman assault had been devastating, but not completely successful. Some priestess families had escaped to remote islands, hidden valleys, and underground caves where they could preserve fragments of their knowledge. Others had gone deep into concealment, maintaining their bloodlines while hiding their true heritage for generations. The goddess wisdom hadn't been completely eliminated. It had been driven so far underground that even its carriers sometimes forgot what they were protecting. But MacLeod's most disturbing discovery concerned what had happened to the surviving bloodlines. According to genealogical evidence she had traced through medieval records, surviving Celtic priestess families had been systematically hunted throughout European history. During the Crusades, during the Inquisition, during the witch trials, each major suppression campaign had specifically targeted the descendants of families that had escaped Roman genocide. The pattern suggested coordination across centuries. Someone had been maintaining records of surviving goddess bloodlines and orchestrating their elimination whenever they began to resurface. The suppression of Celtic knowledge wasn't a historical event that had ended with Roman conquest. It was an ongoing campaign that had continued for 2,000 years. MacLeod's research into modern Celtic genealogies revealed evidence that the hunting hadn't stopped. Families that could trace their ancestry to surviving priestess lines had experienced statistically impossible rates of accidents, suicides, and natural deaths throughout the 20th century. Women who showed signs of inheriting their ancestors' knowledge, unusual healing abilities, psychic sensitivity, or deep connection to natural cycles were particularly likely to die young under mysterious circumstances. The targeting was so systematic that MacLeod had compiled what she called a genocide database, documented evidence that specific bloodlines were being eliminated through methods designed to appear natural while preventing the transmission of genetic and cultural knowledge that threatened patriarchal authority. The families maintaining Mary Magdalene's temple complex, the networks preserving Sumerian tablets, the guardians of suppressed archaeological evidence, all were descended from the same Celtic priestess lines that Romans had tried to eliminate 2 millennia earlier. According to sources close to MacLeod's research, her investigation had revealed something even more disturbing. The descendants of the Roman families that had orchestrated the original Celtic purge were still hunting the survivors. The same bloodlines that had collaborated with Roman genocide had maintained their own genealogical records and continued their ancestors' mission across centuries. These hunting families had achieved positions of power within the very institutions responsible for suppressing goddess knowledge. They served in Vatican intelligence services, government archaeological departments, university administration, and private security organizations. The suppression apparatus that had destroyed Celtic civilization had evolved into modern institutional networks that continued the same mission with updated technology. MacLeod had identified specific individuals whose ancestry connected them to the original Roman Celtic collaborators and who were currently positioned to monitor, suppress, or eliminate evidence of goddess traditions. Her database included names, positions, and documented involvement in cover-ups spanning decades. She had been preparing to publish this information when her car exploded on a remote Scottish road in circumstances that local police classified as an unexplained accident. But MacLeod had anticipated this outcome, following the example of other researchers who had died protecting dangerous knowledge. She had hidden copies of her genealogical database with trusted contacts. Her evidence survived her assassination and continued to circulate among networks that understood its significance. The database revealed that the Hunting families had been monitoring the emergence of goddess evidence worldwide, ready to eliminate any bloodline descendants who threatened to reveal suppressed knowledge. Elena Marchetti's assassination, Hypatia's murder, Sarah Chen's career destruction, all had been carried out by operatives descended from the same families that had betrayed Celtic priestesses to Roman authorities. Most chillingly, MacLeod's research suggested that the Hunting families had developed new techniques for eliminating threatening bloodlines without obvious violence. They had infiltrated medical systems to ensure that women carrying dangerous genetic markers would develop fatal illnesses. They had corrupted environmental systems to expose targeted families to carcinogens and toxins. They had manipulated social systems to isolate potential carriers of goddess knowledge and prevent them from finding each other. The war against Celtic priestess bloodlines had become invisible but more systematic than ever. Instead of Roman legions conducting open genocide, modern Hunting families deployed pharmaceutical companies, industrial polluters, and social engineering to eliminate their targets while maintaining plausible deniability. But MacLeod's database also revealed something that terrified the Hunting families. The Celtic bloodlines were beginning to awaken, despite centuries of suppression, despite systematic elimination campaigns, despite psychological programming designed to make them forget their heritage. Increasing numbers of descendant women were spontaneously manifesting the abilities their ancestors had possessed. Reports emerged worldwide of women suddenly developing healing abilities, prophetic dreams, or deep knowing about natural systems that they had never studied. These awakenings often occurred during times of personal crisis or environmental threat, as if dormant genetic programming was activating in response to planetary danger. The goddess consciousness that Roman legions had tried to eliminate was reasserting itself despite 2 millennia of suppression. The Hunting families recognized this development as an existential threat. If Celtic priestess bloodlines began to awaken en masse, if they reconnected with their suppressed knowledge and abilities, if they united with other survivor networks worldwide, then the entire suppression apparatus that had maintained patriarchal control for centuries would become powerless against restored goddess consciousness. According to intelligence leaked from security organizations, emergency protocols had been activated to accelerate the elimination of known Celtic descendant families. The same bloodlines that had survived Roman genocide, medieval persecution, and modern hunting campaigns were facing a final systematic extermination designed to prevent their awakening from reaching critical mass. But the priestess underground had been preparing for this escalation. The families maintaining Magdalene's temples, the networks preserving Sumerian tablets, the guardians of suppressed archaeological evidence had been secretly reconnecting with surviving Celtic bloodlines and sharing protective knowledge across genetic families. They had learned from their ancestors' mistakes. Instead of concentrating in specific geographic locations where they could be targeted systematically, they had dispersed globally while maintaining communication networks. Instead of preserving knowledge in vulnerable physical repositories, they had embedded it in genetic memory that couldn't be destroyed, without eliminating the entire human species. Most importantly, they had recognized that the suppression campaigns against them weren't separate historical events. They were coordinated attacks by the same families across generations, the descendants of Roman Celtic collaborators, medieval inquisitors, and modern suppression operatives were working together to complete the genocide their ancestors had begun. But so were the survivors. Celtic priestess bloodlines were awakening worldwide, remembering their heritage and preparing to reclaim the knowledge that patriarchal forces had spent 2 millennia trying to eliminate. The final battle between goddess consciousness and its suppressors was beginning, and this time the outcome would determine whether humanity recovered its original, divine feminine heritage or lost it forever. The Celtic purge that began with Roman legions in 61 CE had never ended. It had simply adapted to each new generation of threats and opportunities. But now, the survivors were ready to fight back, armed with the same goddess knowledge that had made their ancestors so dangerous to patriarchal authority. The question wasn't whether the ancient bloodlines would survive. They had already proven their resilience across 20 centuries of persecution. The question was whether they would emerge from concealment in time to prevent their final elimination and restore the consciousness technologies that could transform human civilization. Because somewhere in the genes of ordinary women around the world, Celtic priestess wisdom was awakening, and the families that had spent centuries hunting them were running out of time to prevent the return of the goddess they had tried so desperately to kill. On October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V coordinated the most brutal suppression operation in medieval history. In a single dawn raid, they arrested every Knight Templar in Europe, seized their treasure, and burned their leaders alive. The official charges were heresy, blasphemy, and devil worship. But recently decoded Templar documents reveal they were killed for something far more dangerous. They had discovered proof that Jesus Christ was married to Mary Magdalene, and together they had established a goddess-centered Christianity that threatened the entire foundation of church authority. The discovery that doomed the Templars had been made 90 years earlier, when 9 knights excavated beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. What they found in those underground chambers wasn't gold or religious artifacts. It was a complete archive of early Christian documents that proved everything the Catholic Church taught was a deliberate distortion of original Christian teaching. Brother Geoffrey de Charnay, the Templar chronicler whose encrypted journals were discovered in Swiss bank vaults alongside the priestess underground documents, described the moment when Grand Master Hugues de Payens first entered the sealed chamber beneath Solomon's Temple. According to de Charnay's account, the knights found a library containing over 3,000 scrolls and codices, carefully preserved in cedar chests and sealed amphorae. The texts were written in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, dating from the 1st through 3rd centuries CE. But what made them revolutionary wasn't their age, it was their content. These weren't copies of canonical Gospels or familiar Christian writings. They were original documents from the earliest Christian communities, and they told a completely different story about Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the nature of divine authority. According to the scrolls the Templars discovered, Jesus and Mary Magdalene hadn't been teacher and student. They had been equal partners in establishing a spiritual movement based on the sacred marriage between divine masculine and feminine principles. Their relationship wasn't romantic in the modern sense, but cosmic. They represented the restoration of divine balance that had been lost when patriarchal religions destroyed goddess worship. The hidden text described Jesus as the masculine aspect of solar consciousness and Mary Magdalene as the feminine embodiment of lunar wisdom. Together, they formed a complete divine system that honored both aspects as equally necessary for spiritual development. Jesus provided the active, transformative energy of enlightenment, while Magdalene offered the receptive, nurturing wisdom that integrated spiritual insight into practical healing and community building. But the most dangerous revelation in the Templar archives concerned the true mission of Jesus and Magdalene's partnership. According to the hidden Gospels, they hadn't come to establish a new religion. They had come to restore the original goddess-centered spirituality that patriarchal forces had been systematically destroying. Their movement was an attempt to rebalance human consciousness by reintroducing divine feminine wisdom into a world that had been spiritually crippled by masculine-only religious authority. The texts revealed that Jesus himself had been initiated into goddess mysteries before beginning his public ministry. He had studied with priestesses who preserved remnants of ancient wisdom traditions, learning healing techniques, consciousness technologies, and spiritual practices that originated in the lost civilization described in Sumerian tablets. His miracles weren't supernatural events. They were applications of scientific knowledge that goddess traditions had maintained for millennia. Mary Magdalene's role in this mission was even more significant than the hidden Gospels initially revealed. According to the most secret documents in the Solomon's Temple archive, she wasn't just Jesus' spiritual partner. She was the primary teacher who had instructed him in goddess wisdom. The masculine solar energy he embodied had to be balanced by feminine lunar knowledge before it could be safely transmitted to human consciousness. The Templar documents described Magdalene as possessing complete knowledge of consciousness technologies that could awaken dormant human abilities, the same techniques that Celtic priestesses had used, that Sumerian tablets had described, that Roman legions had tried to eliminate. She had taught Jesus how to activate healing abilities, how to access prophetic vision, how to manipulate energy fields in ways that appeared miraculous to observers who lacked scientific understanding. But perhaps the most revolutionary claim in the Templar archive concerned the crucifixion itself. According to the hidden texts, Jesus' death wasn't a divine sacrifice for human salvation. It was a murder committed by patriarchal authorities who recognized his partnership with Magdalene as a threat to masculine religious control. The crucifixion was the same type of suppression operation that had eliminated Celtic priestesses, that had burned Hypatia's library, that would later claim Elena Marchetti's life. The early Christian movement that emerged after Jesus' death had been hijacked by patriarchal forces who systematically eliminated references to Magdalene's equal authority and rewrote the story to subordinate feminine wisdom to masculine religious hierarchy. The Christianity that became the official religion of the Roman Empire wasn't what Jesus and Magdalene had established. It was a patriarchal distortion designed to prevent the restoration of goddess consciousness they had been attempting. When the Templars discovered this archive, they understood immediately what they possessed, evidence that could destroy the authority of the Catholic Church and restore the balanced spirituality that Jesus and Magdalene had originally established. But they also recognized the danger. If church authorities learned what they had found, the suppression response would be swift and devastating. The Templars' solution was ingenious and ultimately fatal. Instead of revealing their discovery immediately, they decided to gradually introduce goddess-centered Christian practices while building enough military and financial power to protect themselves when the truth was eventually disclosed. They established temples that incorporated both masculine and feminine divine imagery, developed ritual practices that honored the sacred marriage between Jesus and Magdalene, and secretly trained their members in consciousness technologies described in the hidden Gospels. For 90 years, this strategy appeared successful. The Templars became the most powerful military order in Europe, accumulated vast wealth through banking innovations, and established a network of temples and castles that seemed impregnable to external attack. They were preparing for the moment when they would reveal the true Christian Gospels and restore the balanced spirituality that church authorities had corrupted. But church intelligence networks had been monitoring Templar activities and gradually piecing together evidence of their heretical practices. Vatican spies reported ceremonies that honored Mary Magdalene as divine, rituals that celebrated sacred marriage rather than celibacy, and training programs that taught consciousness techniques the Church considered demonic. By 1307, Pope Clement and King Philip had assembled enough evidence to justify complete elimination of the Templar order. The charges brought against the Templars, worshipping false idols, denying Christ's divinity, practicing blasphemous rituals, were actually accurate descriptions of their attempt to restore original Christian teaching. The false idol they worshipped was Mary Magdalene's divine feminine authority. The denial of Christ's divinity was their teaching that Jesus required feminine wisdom to complete his mission. The blasphemous rituals were ceremonies based on the hidden Gospels they had discovered. According to Ducharne's encrypted journals, the Templars had anticipated their persecution and prepared accordingly. Before the arrests began, they had secretly transported the most dangerous documents from the Solomon's Temple archive to hidden locations across Europe. The archive was divided among trusted strongholds. Some scrolls were hidden in Scottish castles, others in Swiss caves, still others in underground chambers beneath Templar properties that church authorities hadn't identified. But the dispersion of evidence wasn't the Templars' only preparation. Ducharne's journals revealed that they had been secretly training selected members in advanced consciousness techniques described in the hidden Gospels, abilities that would allow them to survive persecution and preserve essential knowledge, even if the order was completely destroyed. These initiated Templars possessed what the documents called the Magdalene Mysteries, healing abilities, psychic perception, and energy manipulation techniques that Mary Magdalene had originally taught to Jesus. When church authorities arrested and tortured regular Templars, these advanced practitioners could protect themselves through consciousness technologies that made them nearly immune to physical and psychological pressure. The most secret Templar training involved what they called the sacred marriage initiation, a process that activated both masculine and feminine consciousness principles within individual practitioners. Unlike conventional religious training that suppressed one aspect in favor of the other, Templar initiates learn to integrate solar and lunar energies, accessing the complete spiritual system that Jesus and Magdalene had established. According to Ducharne's descriptions, practitioners who completed this training could demonstrate abilities that seemed miraculous, healing terminal illnesses through energy transmission, accessing knowledge about distant events through psychic perception, and most significantly, awakening dormant spiritual capabilities in others through direct consciousness transfer. These abilities explained why church authorities were so desperate to eliminate the Templars completely. They weren't just suppressing evidence of early Christian goddess worship, they were destroying the last organized group that possessed the consciousness technologies Jesus and Magdalene had originally established. The Templars represented the final remnant of the balanced spirituality that patriarchal Christianity had been designed to prevent. The torture and execution of Templar leaders followed the same pattern that had been used against goddess wisdom carriers throughout history. Grand Master Jacques de Molay and his inner circle were subjected to extreme physical pressure designed to force them to reveal the locations of hidden documents and the identities of initiated members who had escaped arrest. But according to Ducharne's account, the advanced Templars demonstrated something that terrified their interrogators: complete immunity to torture through consciousness techniques that allowed them to separate awareness from physical pain. Some practitioners reportedly maintained perfect calm during execution, displaying abilities that convinced church authorities they were dealing with supernatural forces rather than human resistance. De Molay's final statement before his execution became legendary. He cursed Pope Clement and King Philip, predicting that both would die within a year as divine punishment for destroying Christ's true teaching. Both men did die within the predicted timeframe, creating a mythology around Templar vengeance that would influence European consciousness for centuries. But de Charny's journals suggested something more disturbing than supernatural revenge. The initiated Templars had used consciousness technologies to influence the health and mental state of their persecutors. The curse wasn't mystical pronouncement, it was applied spiritual science that Jesus and Magdalene had developed, preserved in the hidden Gospels, and taught to select Templar practitioners. The destruction of the Templar Order marked the end of organized resistance to church suppression of goddess-centered Christianity. For the first time since Jesus and Magdalene's original mission, no major institution openly challenged patriarchal religious authority or preserved alternative Christian teachings. The balanced spirituality they had established was driven completely underground, where it would remain hidden for 7 centuries. But the Templars' final message before their destruction contained a prophecy that has proved remarkably accurate. According to de Charny's journals, Grand Master de Molay had predicted that the goddess wisdom they were protecting would eventually resurface when humanity faced existential crisis that patriarchal religion couldn't solve. He described a time when environmental destruction, social chaos, and spiritual emptiness would force people to seek the balanced consciousness that Jesus and Magdalene had offered. De Molay's prophecy included specific signs that would indicate the approaching restoration. Ancient goddess sites would be rediscovered, suppressed documents would surface simultaneously worldwide, bloodline families would begin awakening to their heritage, and institutional suppression would become increasingly desperate and visible as authorities recognized their loss of control. Looking at current events through the lens of this medieval prophecy, the signs appear unmistakable. Elena Marchetti's Vatican discovery, the Magdalene Temple complex, the Swiss bank documents revealing the priestess underground, the awakening Celtic bloodlines, all match the pattern de Molay had predicted would herald the return of balanced spirituality. But the Templar documents also contained warnings about the final suppression campaign that would precede the goddess restoration. Church and secular authorities would recognize the approaching end of their control and respond with unprecedented violence against anyone connected to goddess traditions. The persecution would be systematic, global, and designed to eliminate every trace of divine feminine wisdom before it could reach critical mass in human consciousness. According to the Templar prophecy, this final suppression would fail because goddess consciousness was encoded in human genetic memory and would spontaneously awaken regardless of external persecution. The divine feminine hadn't been eliminated by centuries of suppression. It had been driven into dormancy, waiting for planetary conditions that would trigger its automatic restoration. That triggering event, according to de Molay's final vision, would be ecological crisis that threatened human survival. When patriarchal civilization brought the species to the brink of extinction through environmental destruction and warfare, goddess consciousness would emerge as humanity's only hope for balance and survival. The Templars had been eliminated for protecting evidence that this restoration was inevitable. Their archives contain not just historical proof of suppressed goddess tradition, but practical instructions for the consciousness technologies that would be necessary for human survival when patriarchal systems finally collapsed. 700 years later, those hidden Templar archives are beginning to resurface. The descendants of initiated knights who escaped church persecution have preserved the Magdalene mysteries across generations, waiting for the prophesied moment when balanced spirituality would be humanity's only alternative to extinction. The question isn't whether the Templar prophecy will be fulfilled. Current events suggest it already is. The question is whether enough people will awaken to goddess consciousness before the suppression forces complete their final campaign to prevent the restoration that Jesus, Magdalene, and their Templar guardians died protecting. Adolf Hitler's obsession with the occult is well documented, but recently declassified Operation Paperclip files reveal something that historians have never acknowledged. The Nazi war machine wasn't just seeking world domination, it was conducting the most systematic search for goddess artifacts in human history, driven by Hitler's terrifying realization that ancient feminine divine power could either secure his 1,000-year Reich or destroy it completely. The operation began in 1935 when Heinrich Himmler's Ahnenerbe, the Nazi research organization dedicated to discovering Aryan origins, uncovered references to prehistoric goddess civilizations in captured Tibetan monasteries. The documents described advanced technologies developed by matriarchal societies that had been deliberately destroyed by patriarchal invaders, leaving only scattered artifacts and hidden knowledge repositories across the globe. According to Nazi intelligence files discovered in a Berlin bunker in 1994, Hitler became convinced that these goddess technologies represented the ultimate weapon. If Nazi forces could locate and reverse engineer the consciousness manipulation techniques that ancient priestesses had developed, they could create a psychologically controlled population that would serve the Reich without question. More terrifyingly, they believed goddess artifacts could grant supernatural abilities to Nazi leadership, making them literally invincible to conventional warfare. SS Oberfuhrer Wolfram Sievers, who directed the Ahnenerbe's most classified research programs, documented the scope of the Nazi goddess hunt in encrypted journals that Soviet forces captured but never released publicly. According to Sievers' records, Nazi expeditions had been dispatched to every continent searching for artifacts connected to prehistoric goddess worship. Himalayan caves, where Tibetan texts described hidden goddess treasures. Egyptian sites where pre-dynastic goddess temples lay buried beneath later construction, and most significantly, Antarctica, where Nazi researchers believed they had discovered evidence of the original goddess civilization that had once ruled the entire planet. The Antarctic expeditions remain the most mysterious aspect of Nazi goddess research. Official records describe routine territorial mapping, but Sievers' journals reveal something far more extraordinary. According to his encrypted notes, Nazi teams had discovered massive underground structures beneath the Antarctic ice, architectural complexes that showed clear evidence of advanced technology and goddess-centered religious symbolism. The structures weren't recent construction. Carbon dating and geological analysis suggested they were over 12,000 years old, predating known human civilization by millennia. But what made them truly remarkable wasn't their age, it was their preservation. The Antarctic ice had created perfect conservation conditions, maintaining artifacts and texts in pristine condition despite their incredible antiquity. Sievers described chambers filled with crystalline devices that generated energy through unknown principles, libraries containing texts written in scripts that predated all known languages, and most disturbing, preserved bodies of beings that appeared to be human but possessed physiological characteristics that suggested capabilities far beyond normal human limitations. According to Nazi analysis, these preserved beings were the original goddess priestesses, the advanced practitioners who had developed the consciousness technologies described in Sumerian tablets and Celtic traditions. Their bodies showed evidence of deliberately enhanced neural development, enlarged pineal glands, and chromosomal modifications that had apparently allowed them to access psychic abilities and energy manipulation techniques that the Nazis desperately wanted to understand. But the most significant discovery in the Antarctic goddess complex wasn't technological, it was historical. The preserved texts told a story that confirmed the darkest fears of patriarchal suppression forces. Goddess civilization hadn't been primitive prehistoric culture that had naturally evolved into patriarchal society. It had been an advanced global civilization that patriarchal invaders had deliberately destroyed through coordinated warfare that spanned millennia. The Antarctic archives described a golden age when goddess consciousness had unified human civilization under principles of balance, cooperation, and spiritual development. Technology had been developed in harmony with natural systems. Conflicts had been resolved through consciousness integration rather than violence, and human potential had been cultivated through educational systems that activated dormant psychic and healing abilities in entire populations. But the texts also described the systematic invasion of this civilization by patriarchal forces that the goddess priestesses identified as a different human subspecies, a group that lacked the genetic markers for natural psychic development and compensated through technological domination and hierarchical control systems. These invaders had recognized goddess civilization as an existential threat to their authority and had spent centuries developing warfare techniques specifically designed to eliminate feminine consciousness technologies. The war between goddess and patriarchal civilizations hadn't been a single conflict. It had been a systematic campaign spanning thousands of years, with patriarchal forces gradually destroying goddess sites, eliminating priestess bloodlines, and rewriting history to erase all memory of what they had conquered. The suppression campaigns documented in Sumerian tablets, Celtic genealogies, and Christian archives were simply the most recent phases of a conflict that had been ongoing since the dawn of recorded history. Hitler's response to this discovery was immediate and revealing. According to Seifer's journals, the Führer became obsessed with the possibility that Nazi Germany could complete what patriarchal forces had been attempting for millennia: the total elimination of goddess consciousness from human civilization. But he also recognized that goddess technologies could provide the ultimate weapon for ensuring Nazi dominance if they could be controlled and weaponized effectively. The Nazi strategy was characteristically brutal and systematic. Instead of seeking to restore goddess wisdom or integrate it with patriarchal systems, they attempted to extract its power while eliminating its consciousness expanding effects. They wanted the technological capabilities that goddess civilization had developed, the healing techniques, energy manipulation, and psychic abilities, but stripped of the spiritual awareness that made such power compatible with feminine wisdom. The results were catastrophic. According to classified medical files from Nazi human experimentation programs, attempts to activate goddess consciousness technologies in subjects who lacked the proper spiritual preparation created psychological breakdown, violent psychosis, and in several documented cases, spontaneous human combustion. The consciousness techniques that had elevated ancient priestesses to divine status became instruments of torture and death when applied without appropriate wisdom and balance. But the Nazi experiments also revealed something that terrified even SS researchers. Goddess consciousness was far more widespread in the human population than patriarchal suppression forces had realized. When they tested prisoners from various ethnic backgrounds, they discovered that approximately 12% of all humans carried genetic markers associated with psychic abilities and consciousness expansion. The same percentage that Celtic genealogies suggested had survived patriarchal elimination campaigns. This discovery prompted an urgent expansion of Nazi extermination programs. The Holocaust wasn't just anti-Semitic genocide. It was a systematic attempt to eliminate genetic carriers of goddess consciousness before they could awaken to their capabilities and threaten Nazi authority. Jewish populations showed particularly high percentages of psychic genetic markers, but Nazi testing also identified similar traits in Roma, Slavic, and other groups that became targets for systematic elimination. The Nazi goddess hunt reached its climax in 1943 when Himmler authorized Operation Ultima Thule, a desperate attempt to weaponize the consciousness technologies they had discovered in Antarctica. According to Saiva's final journal entries, Nazi researchers had successfully reverse-engineered several goddess artifacts, creating devices that could manipulate human consciousness on a massive scale. The weapons included crystalline devices that could induce psychotic episodes in enemy populations, energy projectors that could disrupt military communications across entire regions, and most terrifyingly, consciousness broadcasters that could implant specific thoughts and emotions into anyone within a 50-kilometer radius. If the technology had been perfected, Nazi forces could have controlled Allied populations without conventional warfare. But the goddess artifacts themselves appeared to resist Nazi attempts at weaponization. Equipment would malfunction at crucial moments. Test subjects would develop abilities that made them uncontrollable, and research facilities would experience accidents that destroyed months of work. According to multiple witness accounts, the consciousness technologies seemed to possess some form of inherent intelligence that actively opposed their use for domination and control. Saiva's final entries suggested that Nazi researchers had begun experiencing supernatural opposition to their work. Scientists reported prophetic dreams warning them to abandon their research. Equipment operators experienced spontaneous healing of health conditions that made them question Nazi ideology, and several facility commanders reportedly suffered nervous breakdowns after claiming they could hear the goddess speaking through the artifacts they were studying. The supernatural resistance climaxed in 1944 when the primary Nazi goddess research facility in the Bavarian Alps was destroyed in what official records described as an Allied bombing raid. But Saiva's encrypted notes tell a different story. The facility was destroyed from within when goddess consciousness technologies achieved some form of critical mass that made them impossible to contain or control. According to his account, researchers working with goddess artifacts had begun spontaneously awakening to advanced psychic abilities that made them immune to Nazi authority. They could perceive the true nature of Hitler's regime, understand the spiritual consequences of their research, and access healing knowledge that made them psychologically incapable of participating in genocide and domination. The awakened researchers sabotaged their own facilities, destroyed irreplaceable artifacts rather than allow their weaponization, and in several cases used their enhanced abilities to disable Nazi operations throughout the region. The goddess consciousness that Hitler had hoped to weaponize had instead converted his own scientists into active resistance against patriarchal authority. But the most disturbing aspect of Saiva's final journal entries concerned what happened to the researchers who had been transformed by contact with goddess artifacts. Instead of being executed as traitors, they simply disappeared. Nazi records showed no evidence of arrests, trials, or executions. The awakened scientists had vanished completely, along with significant quantities of goddess artifacts and research materials. Sievers suspected that the transformed researchers had been extracted by the same underground networks that had preserved goddess knowledge throughout history. The priestess bloodlines, the families maintaining Magdalene's temples, the Celtic survivors, the Templar descendants, they had been monitoring Nazi goddess research and intervened when the awakening process reached critical mass. The Nazi defeat in 1945 ended the most systematic attempt to weaponize goddess consciousness, but it didn't end the search for goddess artifacts. According to Operation Paperclip documents, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies captured Nazi researchers and continued their work under new sponsorship. The Cold War wasn't just political and military competition, it was a race to achieve the consciousness control technologies that Nazi forces had been developing. But the post-war goddess research followed a different model. Instead of attempting to weaponize consciousness technologies directly, intelligence agencies focused on developing countermeasures against potential goddess awakening. They studied the psychological techniques that patriarchal forces had used throughout history, refined methods for identifying and eliminating carriers of goddess genetic markers, and created cultural programming designed to prevent spontaneous spiritual awakening in target populations. The result was a sophisticated suppression apparatus that operated through media manipulation, pharmaceutical intervention, educational indoctrination, and environmental contamination, instead of Roman legions conducting open genocide against Celtic priestesses. Modern suppression forces deployed fluoride in water supplies to calcify pineal glands, electromagnetic frequencies to disrupt psychic perception, and psychological programming through mass media to make populations accept patriarchal authority as natural and inevitable. But the Nazi experiments had also revealed something that suppression forces found deeply threatening. Goddess consciousness was encoded in human genetic structure and would eventually reassert itself regardless of external intervention. The awakening process that had converted Nazi researchers could theoretically occur in any human with the appropriate genetic markers, approximately 12% of the global population. This realization prompted the development of more sophisticated elimination strategies. Instead of attempting to kill all carriers of goddess genetics, suppression forces focused on preventing awakening through environmental and psychological intervention. If goddess consciousness could be kept dormant, if carrier populations could be programmed to suppress their own spiritual development, then the threat could be managed without genocide that might trigger international resistance. The strategy appeared successful for decades, but according to intelligence analyses from the 1990s, suppression forces began detecting signs that the dormancy period was ending. Environmental crisis, social upheaval, and the collapse of traditional authority structures were creating conditions that spontaneously triggered goddess awakening in increasing numbers of genetically compatible individuals. The same pattern that Nazi researchers had documented in their laboratories was beginning to occur globally. Exposure to crisis conditions was activating dormant psychic abilities, spiritual awareness, and consciousness technologies that made affected individuals immune to patriarchal control systems. The goddess awakening that suppression forces had spent centuries preventing was beginning to manifest naturally in response to planetary threat. Current events suggest that the Nazi discovery was prophetic. Goddess consciousness was indeed returning, but not as a weapon that could be controlled by patriarchal authority. It was emerging as humanity's automatic response to existential crisis, activating in individuals whose genetic heritage connected them to the advanced civilization that patriarchal forces had been trying to eliminate for millennia. The Nazi goddess hunt had failed in its original objective of weaponizing divine feminine power, but it had succeeded in proving that such power existed, that it was encoded in human genetics, and that it would eventually return regardless of suppression efforts. Hitler's attempt to control the goddess had instead documented the inevitability of her restoration. Somewhere in the ice of Antarctica, the preserved archives of goddess civilization wait for humanity to rediscover them. And in the genes of ordinary people worldwide, the consciousness technologies that Nazi forces tried to weaponize are spontaneously awakening, preparing to transform human civilization in ways that no patriarchal authority can prevent or control. The goddess hunt that began with Nazi expeditions had revealed humanity's greatest secret. We are all descendants of an advanced spiritual civilization, and the time of our remembering has finally arrived. They're still killing to keep the goddess buried. In the past 5 years alone, 17 researchers investigating suppressed goddess traditions have died under suspicious circumstances. Car accidents on empty roads, sudden heart attacks in healthy individuals, home invasions with nothing stolen, suicides by people who'd never shown signs of depression. The same elimination patterns that claimed Elena Marchetti, Hypatia, and countless others across history are operating right now more efficiently than ever before. But something has changed. The suppression machine that worked flawlessly for millennia is beginning to break down. Too many people are awakening too quickly. Too much evidence is surfacing simultaneously. And most terrifyingly for suppression forces, the genetic carriers of goddess consciousness are starting to recognize each other and coordinate their resistance. Dr. Rachel Morrison discovered this when she began documenting the suspicious deaths of goddess researchers for her book, The Silenced Scholars. What started as academic investigation into historical suppression became a real-time exposure of ongoing elimination campaigns. By the time Morrison realized the danger of her research, surveillance teams were already monitoring her communications and planning her removal. Morrison's database, leaked after her death in a house fire that destroyed all her research, revealed the systematic nature of contemporary suppression operations. The deaths weren't random violence by religious fanatics. They were coordinated eliminations carried out by professional operatives with access to advanced technology and detailed intelligence about target individuals. The kill teams had evolved far beyond medieval inquisitors or Nazi death squads. According to Morrison's research, they operated through legitimate organizations, private security companies, pharmaceutical corporations, government agencies, and academic institutions. Instead of obvious assassinations that might attract attention, they deployed subtle methods designed to appear natural while ensuring complete elimination of threatening knowledge. Heart attack weapons that left no traces in autopsy examinations. Carcinogenic compounds that induced aggressive cancers within months of exposure. Psychological manipulation techniques that drove targets to genuine suicide. Accident scenarios engineered with such precision that even suspicious investigators found no evidence of foul play. The suppression apparatus had perfected the art of invisible murder. But Morrison's most disturbing discovery concerned the intelligence networks that supported these operations. The kill teams possessed detailed information about goddess researchers that could only have come from extensive surveillance of academic communications, personal relationships, and private research activities. They knew about discoveries before they were published, monitored conversations between colleagues, and predicted research directions with uncanny accuracy. The surveillance network extended far beyond traditional intelligence agencies. According to Morrison's leaked files, suppression forces had embedded operatives in universities, museums, publishing companies, media organizations, and even scientific institutions. They monitored archaeological discoveries, tracked genealogical research, and identified individuals whose work threatened orthodox narratives about human spiritual history. Most chillingly, the surveillance teams were specifically targeting people who showed signs of spontaneous goddess awakening. They had developed psychological profiles for individuals likely to manifest psychic abilities, healing capacities, or spiritual insights that connected them to suppressed wisdom traditions. These potential awakeners were identified, monitored, and eliminated before they could fully develop their capabilities or connect with others sharing similar experiences. The targeting criteria were remarkably specific. Women who demonstrated unusual healing abilities, individuals who experienced prophetic dreams about ancient goddess sites, researchers who made intuitive connections between suppressed historical evidence, and anyone whose genealogy connected them to known priestess bloodlines faced systematic surveillance and potential elimination. Dr. Sarah Chen's fate exemplified the evolved suppression methods. After her discovery of Mary Magdalene's temple complex, she hadn't been immediately assassinated like Eleanor Marchetti. Instead, she had been subjected to a sophisticated campaign designed to destroy her credibility, isolate her from support networks, and drive her to psychological breakdown that would discredit her research while serving as a warning to other potential investigators. The psychological warfare included fabricated evidence of mental illness placed in her medical records, planted stories about drug abuse circulated among her colleagues, and engineered relationship problems that destroyed her marriage and friendships. When these methods failed to silence her completely, she was exposed to carcinogenic compounds that induced the aggressive brain cancer that killed her within 8 months. According to Morrison's analysis, Chen's destruction followed a template that had been refined through decades of application against goddess researchers. The psychological pressure was calibrated to maximize suffering while maintaining plausible deniability, ensuring that targets understood they were being eliminated for their discoveries while making it impossible to prove systematic persecution. But the suppression operations were encountering unprecedented resistance. The genetic carriers of goddess consciousness weren't just randomly distributed individuals who could be eliminated in isolation. They were beginning to recognize each other and form protective networks that made targeting significantly more difficult. Morrison's files documented the emergence of what intelligence agencies called spontaneous awakening clusters, groups of genetically compatible individuals who had simultaneously begun manifesting goddess consciousness abilities. These clusters showed remarkable coordination despite having no prior contact, suggesting that awakening was activating some form of psychic communication network that surveillance technology couldn't monitor or disrupt. The awakening clusters were demonstrating abilities that made conventional suppression methods ineffective. Members could sense approaching danger through psychic perception, coordinate protective responses through telepathic communication, and in some documented cases, use energy manipulation techniques to disable surveillance equipment and disrupt assassination attempts. Most disturbing for suppression forces, the awakening individuals were accessing knowledge they had never studied through what appeared to be genetic memory activation. They were spontaneously recalling ancient healing techniques, goddess ritual practices, and consciousness technologies that had been suppressed for millennia. The living carriers of goddess wisdom were becoming walking repositories of the same knowledge that suppression forces had spent centuries trying to eliminate from physical records. The psychological profiles of awakening individuals revealed common patterns that intelligence agencies found deeply threatening. They demonstrated immunity to propaganda and psychological manipulation, showed strong resistance to authority structures that couldn't justify their legitimacy, and possessed innate understanding of natural systems that made them inherently opposed to environmental destruction and social exploitation. From the perspective of institutions dependent on population compliance and resource extraction, The awakening carriers represented an existential threat. If goddess consciousness continued spreading, if awakening individuals continued networking and sharing their abilities, if they began teaching others to access the same capabilities, then every system based on external control and artificial scarcity would become obsolete. The suppression response escalated accordingly. According to leaked intelligence documents, emergency protocols had been activated to accelerate elimination campaigns before awakening reached critical mass. The same organizations that had quietly eliminated individual researchers were now deploying systematic operations designed to identify and neutralize entire networks of potential goddess consciousness carriers. The operations included mass surveillance programs that monitored social media for keywords associated with goddess awakening, medical screening programs designed to identify genetic markers linked to psychic abilities, and psychological testing initiatives that flagged individuals whose personality profiles suggested resistance to patriarchal authority. But the most sinister aspect of the accelerated suppression campaign involved environmental and pharmaceutical interventions designed to prevent awakening in the broader population. Intelligence analyses had determined that goddess consciousness was likely to manifest in approximately 12% of the human population under crisis conditions, nearly 1 billion people worldwide. Rather than attempting to eliminate such a massive population directly, suppression forces focused on preventing awakening through biochemical intervention. Water supplies were treated with compounds that suppressed pineal gland function. Food systems were contaminated with endocrine disruptors that interfered with hormonal cycles associated with psychic development, and atmospheric modification programs were implemented to generate electromagnetic frequencies that disrupted the brainwave patterns necessary for consciousness expansion. The pharmaceutical industry played a crucial role in this suppression strategy. Medications for depression, anxiety, and attention disorders were specifically formulated to block the neurochemical processes that facilitated spiritual awakening. Instead of healing mental health conditions, these drugs were designed to maintain a psychological state that made goddess consciousness impossible to access. Educational and media systems reinforced the biochemical suppression through carefully designed programming that conditioned populations to reject their own spiritual experiences as mental illness, dismiss evidence of suppressed history as conspiracy theory, and accept patriarchal authority as the only legitimate source of truth and guidance. The result was a comprehensive suppression apparatus that operated through every aspect of modern civilization: medical, educational, environmental, technological, and psychological. The goddess consciousness that suppression forces had spent millennia eliminating through direct violence was now being prevented through systematic poisoning of human potential itself. But the strategy was failing. Despite comprehensive suppression efforts, awakening was accelerating worldwide. Environmental crisis, social breakdown, and the obvious inadequacy of patriarchal solutions to global problems were triggering goddess consciousness in individuals whose genetic heritage connected them to suppressed wisdom traditions. The awakening wasn't limited to identified bloodline families. It was manifesting in ordinary people who had no conscious connection to goddess traditions, but whose ancestors had apparently carried dormant genetic programming that activated automatically under species threat conditions. The consciousness technologies that ancient priestesses had developed weren't just preserved in hidden archives, they were encoded in human DNA, waiting for the right conditions to reassert themselves. Morrison's final research before her death suggested that suppression forces were facing an impossible situation. They could continue eliminating individual awakeners, but the genetic programming that triggered goddess consciousness was embedded in such a large percentage of the population that systematic elimination would require genocide on a scale that would destroy human civilization itself. Alternatively, they could continue their environmental and pharmaceutical suppression strategies, but these methods were becoming less effective as awakening accelerated and more people began sharing techniques for overcoming biochemical interference with spiritual development. The third option, negotiating some form of coexistence between patriarchal institutions and emerging goddess consciousness, appeared impossible given the fundamental incompatibility between systems based on external control and consciousness technologies that made such control obsolete. According to intelligence projections leaked in Morrison's files, suppression forces were preparing for what they called final solution protocols, systematic deployment of biological weapons, environmental catastrophes, and social collapse scenarios designed to eliminate the majority of human population before Goddess. Awakening could reach critical mass. The reasoning was coldly logical. If they couldn't prevent the restoration of Goddess consciousness through selective suppression, they would create conditions that eliminated most of humanity while preserving only populations that could be controlled through traditional patriarchal methods. But Morrison's research suggested that this strategy would also fail. The same genetic programming that was triggering Goddess awakening under current crisis conditions would accelerate even more rapidly under extreme survival threat. Instead of preventing the return of divine feminine consciousness, systematic genocide would trigger its full manifestation in every human capable of accessing it. The kill list that began with Elena Marchetti's assassination was reaching its inevitable conclusion. Suppression forces could continue eliminating individual threats, but they couldn't stop the genetic awakening that was spontaneously activating in millions of people worldwide. The goddess they had spent millennia trying to bury was returning through the biology of the human species itself. Morrison's final entry before her death contained a prediction that has proved remarkably accurate. The suppression apparatus would become increasingly desperate and visible as they recognized their ultimate failure. The invisible elimination campaigns that had worked for centuries would give way to obvious persecution that would expose the conspiracy to public awareness and accelerate the awakening process they were trying to prevent. The kill list continues, but now it's generating more resistance than compliance. Every researcher eliminated becomes a martyr who inspires others to investigate suppressed truth. Every obvious assassination reveals the desperation of forces that had previously operated in shadow. Every failed suppression attempt demonstrates the inevitability of goddess restoration. The war against divine feminine consciousness that began in ancient Sumer is entering its final phase. But the outcome has already been determined by the genetic programming that ensures goddess wisdom will return when humanity faces existential threat. The only question remaining is whether the suppression forces will accept their defeat gracefully or attempt to destroy human civilization rather than allow the restoration of balanced consciousness. The goddess is returning, and no amount of killing can stop her. The evidence is awakening in the hearts and minds of people worldwide, and the truth they died to protect is finally ready to transform human civilization forever. Because in the end, the goddess was never really buried. She was simply sleeping in our genes, waiting for the moment when her children would remember who they truly are.